Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman. Nice to see you, Pat. And
Nice.
we have a great guest today. We're very excited to meet him. Trevor Timm is the co founder and executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, a leading advocate for civil liberties and press freedom. Welcome, Trevor. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We want to start before we want to talk to you about the Freedom of the Press Foundation, what you're doing now, and then the history and the work that you did with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But could we just start with maybe a little background about the situation that we're in this country in terms of press freedom? And one of the areas I want to start with is the government's ability to hide its crimes, either by claiming national security or just by classifying information and making it off limits to journalists and even judges. I had my eyes open to this some years ago. Around 2008, I represented a Guantanamo detainee. And he was a poor shopkeeper from Kandahar, and he was sold to the Americans for a bounty. And everything in his file was classified, and every single detainee, I think at that time there were some 300 detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Every single shred of paper in all the files was classified. And so I had to get a security clearance to meet my client, to work on the case. I had to fly to a secure facility to do any work on the case, to look at the file. And when I looked at it, I'm like, why is this classified? There's nothing in here that has any national security concern. And I think that was true for a lot of my colleagues, although I couldn't even talk to my colleagues about their clients and their files. But what I came to see is that the reason for this was so that the government could lie with impunity. Because if you remember, Dick Cheney was saying, these are the worst of the worst. We got them. These are all terrorists. They're so bad we have to tie them up because they'll chew through the cables on the planes when we transport them. And there was no way you could push back on that because every hearing was closed, no press was allowed. The press couldn't look at the files. Now, one of the things that Julian Assange did is release the Gitmo files. And in my particular case, what happened is when those files came out, the government claimed, because that basically exposed that my client was not connected to the Taliban. He was not connected to Al Qaeda. And so the government said, well, we found a new document that shows your client's guilty, but we're not going to show it to you because we've classified it at a security clearance level above your clearance. And so I complained to the judge. I said, Judge, how can I possibly represent my client if I can't see the key evidence? And the judge said, well, that's not it's the government's power. They can do that. I can't do anything about it. I found that so outrageous. I wrote a column about it. But of course, then the government threatened to prosecute me because they said I disclosed confidential information, which I didn't. But once they took away my security clearance, I couldn't represent my client. But anyway, that's a different story. But I'd like you to talk just a little bit about the problem of the government's ability to make information about what it does. Let me just say one more thing. Jimmy Dore, I think, is quoted as saying, or I've heard him make this point, that in a democracy, we should know everything about the government and they should know nothing about us. And yet it seems like we're in an opposite world where they know everything about us and we know nothing about what they're doing. So could you talk about that problem and how you see it and how you see this moment in history?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent anecdote that really gets to the heart of the matter. When we look at the secrecy system, oftentimes it ends up in absurd situations. I'm sure you were in a similar situation when the Gitmo files came out, where all of this information was public. It was published on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. Yet the government was also probably arguing that you couldn't use that in court because they still considered it classified. And, the classification system in the United States has been broken for 50 or 60 years. Daniel Ellsberg, our co-founder at Freedom of the Press Foundation, was talking about this in the early 70s when he leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times about the Vietnam War. But really, in the post 9/11 era, the secrecy system in the United States has absolutely exploded. The Washington Post did this great investigation in 2010 or 2011 talking about, it was called Top Secret America. And it showed that, there was millions of security clearances issued by the government each year, where there is this whole world. Donald Trump actually talks about the deep state. He talks about it in this caricature. But the deep state, in a sense, is very real in the idea that there is a group of millions of people that have access to a whole host of information about what the US government is doing, yet the American public is not allowed to know about it. And the system is created in a way that allows the government to hold all of the cards. So if there is somebody that they are prosecuting, they can say, well, the evidence is secret. We may be able to let the lawyer look at some of the documents, but not all of them. We're not going to allow the jury to look at them. In cases like in the George W. Bush administration, when we were talking about the torture program or NSA warrantless wiretapping, they were using the secrecy system to shield literal illegality and systematic unconstitutional actions. And then they can turn around and say, well, it was illegal for somebody to tell a newspaper that we were doing that. And then when people bring lawsuits, they can bring up what's called the state secrets privilege and say, essentially, that it doesn't matter whether we were engaged in illegal behavior or not. The court is not authorized to look at and rule on this information because it is also classified. So they, essentially use the secrecy system as a shield in order to prevent public accountability in virtually every sense. And when everything involving national security and even foreign policy is considered classified by the government, they don't need to go around arresting reporters all the time because they control their employees who have access to this information. They can prosecute them whenever they want. They can have total surveillance over what they do. And what ends up happening is the American public is left in the dark about their government's policies virtually around the world.
Well, there was a case recently, right, Trevor, just with respect to the Pentagon and the Iran war, where there was a journalist or there was a leak, and the Trump administration threatened to jail the leaker. Can you talk about that and how that was that new ground that they were on in making those kinds of assertions, and what happened there?
Actually, Trump threatened to jail the journalist if they didn't give up the leaker. We don't know what the aftermath of that case is because who knows what the Justice Department is doing there. But this is another tool of the U.S. government. It's a good time to bring up the Espionage Act because we're probably going to be talking about it a lot today. The Espionage Act is a law that was written in World War I, so it's over 100 years old. And I think a lot of times when people hear the word or the phrase Espionage Act, they think this is about spies. U.S. government employees selling information to foreign governments for a profit. But what the Espionage Act, or at least a couple of provisions of the Espionage Act, are primarily used for is to go after sources who give information in the public interest to American journalists, not for any monetary value or anything in return, really just to inform the American public. And this law was first used against the aforementioned Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, but really lied dormant until after 9/11, when the Bush administration and then the Obama administration realized that this law could be used as yet another weapon to enforce secrecy. And so what the Espionage Act really does is it says that anybody who has access to national defense information and gives it to somebody who is unauthorized to receive it is committing a felony. And so the Trump administration has used this law at least twice in the past 2 years against potential whistleblowers, one for a source that talked to the Washington Post, another who talked to Seth Harp, who wrote this fantastic book called The Fort Bragg Cartel. The Obama administration used it at least 8 or 9 times, more than all other administrations combined before him, and Trump has really supercharged it. And what the Espionage Act essentially does is it says that if you are a source within the government who witnesses illegal behavior or waste or fraud or abuse, and you go to a journalist and tell them, you actually cannot bring this up in court. So the defendant will say, oh, well, I will tell my story to the jury. I will tell them I'm not a spy. I wanted to inform the American public about illegal behavior. The government will in turn say, that is inadmissible. It doesn't matter why you leaked something. It doesn't matter that it didn't harm national security. It doesn't matter that there were huge benefits for the public. All of this information is ruled inadmissible. The jury is not allowed to hear it. And what it essentially is a go straight to jail card for these sources and these whistleblowers. And so they create this massive secrecy system, and then they enforce it against their own employees by threat of destroying their life. And it means that the American public is poorer for it because they can get away with a whole host of things that they wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Right, and because the penalties are so severe under the Espionage Act, and the defendant is basically defenseless because, as you say, he can't explain to the jury, who might be sympathetic and might decide that this is an abuse of power to prosecute this person under this act because he didn't actually commit espionage. He's not allowed to say that, and so you're basically looking at a certain conviction and a sentence of, maybe more than a decade or worse in prison. So it forces a lot of people, and I think we've seen a lot of these cases. John Kiriakou, we've heard a lot of these stories, even on this show, of people that are sort of pressured into pleading guilty because how am I going to fight this if I can't tell my side of it to the jury? It's a way of the government sort of strong-arming people into silence, which is, it's kind of a trick also when you get a security clearance, because if you accept a security clearance, you're signing a document that says, it doesn't say this outright, but it basically says that if I see evidence of crimes, I must keep my mouth shut. Otherwise, I'm committing a felony, and I'm basically agreeing that I can go right to jail. So, it's a trick bag. Now, maybe this would be maybe a good transition into Assange, because he never signed a security clearance. He was not even an American citizen, and yet he was prosecuted under this. Could you take us back to sort of the beginning? I guess it was around 2011 that you decided that you got involved in starting this organization. And one of the things that you were doing, there was a financial blockade. So this is something that's in the news right now. The Trump administration is trying to blockade cargo going through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is a weapon of the U.S. government. Well, at that time, maybe you could talk a little bit about Assange and what made you interested in wanting to help Assange, because I think it was around 2000. WikiLeaks began in maybe 2006, 2007, and one of the first big disclosures was the Manning, I believe, Bradley Manning files, which just disclosed government crimes, evidence of government crimes, including the deliberate targeting and murder of civilians and journalists in Iraq and maybe in Afghanistan as well. Maybe you could talk about sort of the beginnings of the Freedom of the Press Foundation and maybe first the importance of what Assange was doing. And the one other thing that I want you to mention is that Assange WikiLeaks never once was forced to retract anything that it said. And you could correct me if I'm wrong, but 100% truthful. There was a very few journalists that could make that claim. And yet they became public enemy #1. How did that happen? And tell us why, and tell us your story about getting involved and supporting them with the Freedom of the Press Foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so you have to understand the context of WikiLeaks in 2009 and 2010, as we were just talking about before. This is a post 9/11 world where the United States government is expanding the classification system and the secrecy system exponentially, that they are committing blatantly illegal acts, whether we're talking about torture or warrantless wiretapping, secret prisons, illegal wars, all sorts of things under the US government's name. They were at the same time pressuring news organizations not to run stories about this. There's a famous story about the New York Times, who had the story about NSA warrantless wiretapping before the 2004 election, but the Bush administration essentially scared them into not publishing it until 18 months later. It could have tipped the election at that time. So news organizations were scared. The government was using its secrecy powers more than ever before, and then they were blocking all accountability in court with the state secrets privilege. And so for those who worked on government secrecy issues and government transparency issues, WikiLeaks at the time was a breath of fresh air. They were saying, sources come to us. We will not be afraid to publish these important stories or these important documents. And they were innovators at the time too. They had a digital whistleblower submission system that made it safer to submit documents to them than it would be going through regular phone calls and emails. And so around 2010, WikiLeaks received a huge tranche of documents from Chelsea Manning. And these were hundreds of thousands of documents that covered the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, hundreds of thousands of State Department cables, and then the Gitmo files, which you mentioned earlier, that affected your case. And so WikiLeaks partnered with news organizations around the world, including the New York Times, and this was the #1 story in the world, not just for a day, but for months and months. The New York Times and other newspapers were publishing stories about what was happening behind the scenes in Iraq and Afghanistan and around the world because of these State Department cables. And it was incredibly important for the public to understand what was going on. And, we should also mention that it has been essentially settled law in the United States for decades and decades that even if the government can go after government employees, their own employees, for secrecy violations. And even if you say that the Espionage Act is constitutional and it's okay for them to use, the First Amendment has always protected journalists because they haven't signed that secrecy pledge. That the First Amendment says, actually, we can publish this information even if the government considers it secret. The New York Times and Washington Post have been doing that for decades. But because WikiLeaks was seen as more radical than regular news organizations, the Obama administration and other both Democrat and Republican politicians decided that they needed to crack down on WikiLeaks, that they could not let this stand. And so instead of prosecuting them, because again, the First Amendment protects WikiLeaks just as it does the New York Times, they decided to do something else. Senator Joe Lieberman, who was a Democrat at the time, and Republican Peter King pressured payment processors to cut WikiLeaks off from financing. So WikiLeaks was funded 99% by Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. They didn't have any large donors. It was just, ordinary internet users sending them $100 or $50 or things like that, but multiplied over tens of thousands of users, they were able to raise a ton of money. And so instead of going to court to try to cut them off, these senators and congressmen decided to pressure the payment processors directly and imply or say behind closed doors that what WikiLeaks was doing was illegal, which it clearly wasn't. And it was essentially an end run around the First Amendment, and it was our opinion at the time that this was a huge press freedom violation, even though there was no court case involved. And so
Trevor, can I just interrupt you there? So
Yeah.
just a question. Is that the first time? Because this is a tactic, obviously, that's been used since to cut people off that they don't like by cutting off their payment processors. So did they invent this? Was that the first time that it ever happened?
it was certainly the first time that it happened on such a global scale. to the point where it was front page news. There's probably been a few other smaller cases involving individuals or companies that we haven't heard of. Like there's a case in the Seventh Circuit about a Sheriff Dart, who tried to do this to another party. But the fact that this was front page news all over the world, that for one news story everybody was talking about, and yet the U.S. government could decide, oh, I'm just going to have a phone call with some executives and cut them off from their money supply. And so I got together with a group of other free speech advocates, including Glenn Greenwald, who I think was a guest on your show a few months ago, Daniel Ellsberg, the founder of EFF, J.P. Barlow, the actor John Cusack, and many others. And we decided to create an organization that we called Freedom of the Press Foundation. So this was around mid-2012, after the blockade had been in place for a few months and WikiLeaks was being choked financially. And so there was two main goals for this organization. Number one, to promote the idea that journalists should be more aggressive, that whistleblowers should come forward, that the secrecy system is abused all the time and incredibly broken. And the other being that we should not, as a society, allow the U.S. government to make backroom phone calls that cut off financial support to publishers because the government didn't like them, and that we're protected by the First Amendment. And so we launched at the end of 2012 with the idea that we were going to break the WikiLeaks financial blockade. So we started crowdfunding back when don't get me wrong, we didn't invent crowdfunding. It was nowhere near the what it is today, though. Kickstarter had just started at that point. GoFundMe didn't even exist. And the idea was, let's raise money for not just WikiLeaks, which is under a financial blockade, but let's raise money for other independent news organizations, transparency outlets, people who are doing innovative work to bring us a less secret government. And so within the first week or two, we had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for WikiLeaks and for a lot of other groups. That probably rose to millions in the next few years. And we essentially ended the financial blockade with the idea being that these payment processors likely couldn't cut us off because we were a U.S. nonprofit. We had the backing of an incredible board of free speech advocates who were going to make a lot of noise if they decided to, and with the idea that everything that WikiLeaks was doing and all these organizations were doing was entirely protected by the First Amendment.
Can I just ask you, it's also true that you were a 501c3, so you were a not-for-profit, and so you also protect, by the system that you guys came up with also protected the donors because they could contribute to you, and the government couldn't necessarily know whether they were supporting WikiLeaks or someone else. So it protected them from, and it gave them maybe more courage to want to support a very controversial organization that was really in the crosshairs of the government. So is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the worries back then was that the government was making lists of people who visited the WikiLeaks site or decided to vote for them. And so there was this chilling effect that was happening where donors who may want to support WikiLeaks were worried about what would happen to them, even though giving to WikiLeaks, again, was completely legal for them as well. And so we actually used the technology on our website to create a system that, allowed people, we knew people were donating to us, but their anonymity was protected as far as which organizations that they were giving to and which percentage they were giving to each organization. And so, I think it gave a lot of confidence to donors who otherwise might have been afraid.
So my understanding of, sort of the political situation at that time, so before 2016, would it be fair to say that the Democratic Party was sort of, in some ways, was a supporter of WikiLeaks, or had a favorable view, or hardcore Democrats had a favorable view of WikiLeaks, but that changed in 2016 after the election when Assange published emails which showed sort of corruption at the highest levels of the Democratic Party, and in particular, the high levels of the Democratic Party colluding with Hillary Clinton during the primary to kneecap Bernie Sanders and to make sure that he was not going to carry the primary. And that sort of changed the opinion of a lot of high level Democrats, and then they became much more anti WikiLeaks. So is that a fair, that sort of a,
I would actually disagree with at least the first part of that, in the sense that high-level Democrats or Democratic leadership never liked WikiLeaks, because you got to remember this was in the first term of the Obama presidency, where actually Democrats not only controlled the White House but both houses of Congress, and so despite the fact that a lot of the stuff that WikiLeaks published touched on the Bush administration, it was the Obama administration that was taking a lot of embarrassment for it. Even the vice president at the time, Joe Biden, famously called Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist. However, WikiLeaks did have a lot of support broadly on the left, I guess you could say, as opposed to like the political elite. Because there were so many people who were frustrated with the secrecy system during the Bush administration. But I would say the second half of your statement is correct, where while it was largely the left that appreciated WikiLeaks and was donating to WikiLeaks during 2010 and 2011, once WikiLeaks started publishing the DNC emails and then the emails from the Hillary Clinton campaign, it did seem to turn on a dime as to who their supporters were. Donald Trump was saying in the 2016 campaign, if we can think that far back, it feels like 5 decades ago, but it was really only 1 decade ago. He was saying things like, "I love WikiLeaks" on the campaign trail. And so while maybe you could say that there was low-level hatred for Julian Assange during the early Obama years, certainly rank-and-file Democrats started hating WikiLeaks a lot more starting in 2016. But you have to remember, again, going back to the First Amendment, what WikiLeaks was doing was not participating in stealing information. They were receiving information from a source. Now, this source hacked these documents and they committed a crime. But the Supreme Court itself has said that if a journalist or publisher, as long as they did not participate directly in a crime, can publish information that comes out of one. And even after the 2016 election, a federal judge, after I think it was the DNC sued WikiLeaks, a judge ruled, hey, sorry, this is protected First Amendment speech.
well, then could you talk a little bit about what happened in 2018? Because this is a little confusing, I think, to a lot of people. A decision was made to stop being a conduit to provide funds for WikiLeaks, so that the Freedom of the Press Foundation you could no longer contribute to the Freedom of the Press Foundation and have that money support WikiLeaks. This was now there's different explanations for why that happened. You could tell us. I know that Julian Assange himself accused the Freedom of the Press Foundation for bowing to political pressure. So what is your understanding of what happened there, and why was that decision made in 2018?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, and we certainly didn't bow to political pressure. There was no political pressure on us. What happened was the financial blockade was over. WikiLeaks was taking donations via credit cards directly at that point, and probably had been for a while. They were not even really promoting that people should donate through us on their social media accounts anymore. And we felt all of the other crowdfunding that we had done for all of the other organizations was temporary. The reason that we kept WikiLeaks on for so long was because this financial blockade existed. And once the financial blockade was over, we didn't feel like it was our mission to just accept donations on behalf of WikiLeaks forever. And so, as a board, we decided that, essentially our mission was complete in that sense. But the other thing that you have to remember is that and that's why I think it's a little silly to that someone, or even if it was Assange, to say that we were bowing to political pressure. We have been staunch supporters of WikiLeaks' right to publish secret information since the moment we started, and we have never wavered on that once. In fact, I even testified as an expert witness on the behalf of Julian Assange in his extradition trial in London. And so, when the Trump administration, after saying "I love WikiLeaks" in 2016, turned around in 2018 and decided to do what the Obama administration didn't do, which was actually prosecute Julian Assange under the Espionage Act. We were the first organization that was shouting from the rooftops how dangerous this was, not just for Assange's rights, but for the rights of every American journalist. And the idea that any administration, Republican or Democrat, should be prosecuting a publisher for, as you say, publishing truthful information, strikes at the heart of the First Amendment. And I think that we are seeing the unfortunate consequences of the Trump administration bringing that prosecution, and then the Biden administration shamefully continuing it and bringing it to a conclusion in the 2020s.
If I could just clarify one thing, because so you say the financial blockade had ended. So this is confusing to me. So does that mean that when the Trump administration came in 2017, they reversed the policy of the prior administration in terms of pressuring these banks, MasterCard, PayPal, to not facilitate donations to?
No, I think it actually happened before. So there was, and this didn't get reported widely, and frankly, at the time, we weren't totally aware of it. But there was some litigation going on in Europe involving at least MasterCard and maybe Visa, in which they were essentially challenging the financial blockade. So at some point in the couple years after the blockade was in existence, probably around 2014 or 2015. It's been like a decade, so I can't tell you the exact dates. The credit card companies quietly backed down and started accepting donations again. And so it wasn't necessarily that's part of the problem with these financial blockades. It's not necessarily official government policy. Like, we don't have any evidence that the Obama administration itself was putting its thumb on the scales with these credit card companies and saying that this is our policy and you must stick to it. It was really a few phone calls from a couple different congressmen, probably coupled with veiled threats, that made them take this action. And at some point, they realized that it was probably too much trouble for what it was worth, and decided to essentially end it.
Well, there's so many things there, Trevor, in terms of, number one, the idea of a financial blockade and the idea that you can pull these strings to cancel people's bank accounts, cancel their livelihood, and you can do it with a private phone call. And therefore, even though there's a Supreme Court case that's pretty on point with this, that it's a way to get around the First Amendment, or so people thought. There's that. There's the bipartisan nature of squashing free speech when it suits their political interests, right? So Trump said he loved WikiLeaks when that suited his political interests. Fast forward a few years, and he's conspiring to murder Julian Assange in London. So, it just depends on what their political interests are. And then the Biden administration taking on a case where it said it would damage the New York Times, and you guys, among others, pointed this out, that it wasn't just about WikiLeaks, it's about any United States journalist. But then they continue the case, even though they say that Trump was Hitler and, everything that Trump does is anathema. And then when they get in, do they change his policy? No, they don't. They keep the policy because it suits their political interest to do so. So there's a lot there in terms of, this real callous disregard for principles of any kind, and certainly principles that support the First Amendment. So maybe we can pivot now, because we don't have unlimited time, about what you see today as some of the biggest threats to free expression in the United States. And then I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the rest of the world eventually. But we have a new administration. The last administration was horrible with respect to free speech, and they had very nefarious ways of doing things. Now we have a new administration. How are they, and what are their biggest what are the biggest threats that they've created right now?
Excuse me. I think we can look to the financial blockade as kind of well, we can talk about the SPLC case, which we can discuss in a few minutes, which is very analogous to the WikiLeaks case. But the idea of leaning on companies or news organizations or corporations to get the censorship you want without going to court is actually a hallmark of the second Trump administration, and it is what they've been doing kind of across the board. There's another phrase for this, which is called jawboning, which is a First Amendment term, with the idea being that you're not going to go to court to censor somebody, but you're going to threaten them that you may punish them for something if they don't do what you want. And so we have seen, especially with the Trump FCC, that they have no problem threatening news networks like ABC or CBS or even potentially CNN or even Fox with regulatory action if they are not producing stories that the Trump administration likes. The Trump administration, or I should say Trump himself, also is wielding a weapon that no other president has before, which is personally filing lawsuits against news organizations that also report stories that he finds unflattering. He ties them up in litigation for years, and in fact, this has been his strategy even before he ever considered running for president, when he was just a real estate mogul. He talked in the 1990s when he sued a Bloomberg journalist that he actually didn't even care that whether he won or lost. He just wanted to make them bleed monetarily. And so, Trump has close to a half a dozen lawsuits going on right now. And what he has essentially combined the FCC's regulatory power with the idea that he can bring these personal lawsuits. And we saw early in the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, ABC hand over, I think it was $14 million personally to Donald Trump or Donald Trump's purported presidential library to settle a libel claim that pretty much every First Amendment expert knew ABC would win going away.
Was this the one where they said on air that he was a rapist, or that he was convicted criminally of rape? Was that the allegation?
Yeah, there was I think it was George Stephanopoulos said rape instead of sexual assault.
Sexual assault. And so you think he would have won, that ABC would have won that in court?
Oh, I absolutely think he would have won in court. There is actually a case in Chicago that is almost virtually identical to this that we wrote about in the Chicago Sun-Times. I can send it to you for you to give to your readers. But you also have to understand that President Trump is virtually libel-proof as well. Like, he's the most powerful person in the world. The idea behind the Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan, is there's a very high bar for public officials to bring these types of cases, so they can't so they essentially can't scare news organizations into silence. But then Trump took it a step further with CBS and filed claims in a Texas court about a 60 Minutes interview that Kamala Harris did that didn't even mention Trump, but he said was unfairly edited. And of course, news organizations and literally everybody who does anything news related edits things all the time. Interviews are edited every hour of every day for all sorts of reasons. It's a core First Amendment protected activity. Yet Trump was claiming that it was unfair business practices and a whole host of other things. This case was, while I certainly think that ABC would have won the first case, the second case was absolutely laughable. If you polled 100 First Amendment lawyers across the political spectrum, all 100 of them would have said this is a joke. Yet, because CBS was trying to, or CBS's parent company, Paramount, was trying to complete a merger, they essentially paid off Donald Trump $16 million to make this
In that
lawsuit.
one, if I remember, the allegation was that had an interview with Kamala Harris, and in that interview, she sort of muffed some answers, and they gave her a redo, and then they spliced it back together, so that they played the redo and not the muffed answer. And Trump claimed that that was somehow that not somehow that was advantaging the Harris campaign, right, and was in effect a contribution to Harris. It's kind of a far-fetched argument, but
Right. I don't even know if they gave her a redo. I think they just edited something for the promo, and then when they showed the interview, they aired a different portion of her answer,
yeah.
which again is something news organizations do all the time. Fox News edits Donald Trump's interviews to look flattering every day. And the idea that the government should be micromanaging editing choices of major news programs would just make a mockery of our Constitution. And you could point to 10,000 other interviews that happened during that time by both candidates that would be susceptible to this. It would grind the news industry to a halt, whether you think that the edit was unfair or fair. Like, I think we have to understand, like, the First Amendment allows a broad range of speech, and that means sometimes that news organizations that we like are going to air unfair interviews, and news organizations we don't like are going to air unfair edited interviews. But that is the deal we have made with the First Amendment, so that the government can't decide to micromanage who gets to edit interviews and who doesn't.
Well, the idea of people in power, presidents pressuring people, pressuring news organizations to censor speech, it certainly is a bipartisan thing. And, we saw that in the Biden administration as well, especially during COVID, and the Twitter files, which exposed, very heavy-handed actions by government officials to censor private corporations and threaten them, and also threaten them with, as you talked about, changing the law, and their immunity could go away if they don't play ball with the government. So we've certainly seen that through it's a bipartisan problem.
No, I would totally agree. I mean, sorry to interject, but what the Biden administration did with the continuing the WikiLeaks prosecution and essentially getting a plea deal that was the first time a non-government employee had to, and a publisher had to plead guilty to essentially publishing information that was truthful. Absolutely horrible. The jawboning that you're talking about with the Biden administration during COVID, an appeals court has ruled that was a violation of the First Amendment as well. And that's really the problem with the American public's view of free speech in the past 20 or so years, or maybe since the First Amendment was invented, and now it's just supercharged because of the internet. Everybody changes their supposed principles on a dime. If a Democrat is in charge, where some people are like, well, it's okay that they're pressuring social media companies because we think it's in our best interest, and then the Trump administration can use those same precedents to go after people that you like, and then the same thing happens with Republicans. And so, if we had more politicians and a larger percentage of the public that stuck to their principles on this thing, I think we'd be in a lot better spot.
I think you're absolutely right. It's like that's exactly what's happened. It's just like in the Assange case that you were going over earlier. When events favor your party, they're fine. When actions favor your party, they're fine. When they don't, then all of a sudden you find principles. But you lose those principles immediately after. And you saw the same thing happen with the Trump administration, that Glenn Greenwald has pointed out a lot, that they were very pro-free speech because they were censored. But as soon as they came in, they started censoring colleges, universities, and other things as well to prevent things that they didn't like. So suddenly their principles went by the wayside, and so did all their followers, apparently.
I mean, a
too.
great example of this is during In the post 2016, 2020 election, there was so much talk about fake news or misinformation or disinformation, and the government needs to do something about this, and we need to regulate it. And a lot of Democrats' answers, or people who supported Democrats' answers, was we must empower the FCC in order to regulate the internet. And our argument at the time, which I think has borne out, even more so than maybe we thought, was that why would you hand the FCC the power to control speech when in 4 years Donald Trump has a very good chance of winning the election again, and they are going to be in charge of the FCC, and they are going to take these powers and multiply them by 10x and decide that every search engine must say that Donald Trump is the greatest president of all time, or any other absurd situation that you can think of. I think part of the problem, especially with politicians, is they're only looking 6 inches in front of their face, and they are either not paying attention to the precedent that they may set, or they are willfully ignoring the precedent that they may set, so that they can score political points.
Yeah, one of the things we saw with Trump was, I think we all remember him coming into office and saying free speech is back, and he's going to reverse all of the abuses of the Biden administration. And then, as you and Pat pointed out, it went downhill very quickly. And maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of the weaponization of anti-Semitism after October 7th, 2023. And this has been not just the United States and Trump, although it's certainly Trump has, deported people for authoring an op-ed and, tried to, kick people out of the country if they're here on a green card and they say the wrong thing about another foreign country. Can you talk a little bit about that and about how this has sort of become a worldwide problem of free speech and the weaponization of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, like there was that executive order that the Trump administration came out with, like I think on their first day, or even maybe before they had gained office, where they talked about how they were bringing back the First Amendment. And I read the executive order pretty skeptically, but also I read it and was like, well, if this is true, then this is actually a good thing. Unfortunately, almost from day one, they totally ignored what they said and have done more damage to free speech than I think any other prior administration, despite the fact that both the Biden and Obama administration did horrible things, especially on press freedom. I think the case that you mentioned about the Tufts student who wrote an op-ed, essentially a pro-Palestinian op-ed that she was a co-author on. There was four other co-authors. If you read the op-ed, it is, it's pretty mild, and yet, she was here on a visa and getting an education. She wasn't here illegally. Yet the Trump administration essentially kidnapped her off the street and tried to deport her because they said that her speech was not in furtherance of United States national security and
Yeah,
foreign
she had
policy.
the wrong opinion, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, here we are back at national security. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
I mean, that's one of Trump's hallmarks. Like I keep saying the word supercharged, but he's really supercharged a lot of the problems with the national security system that have developed post 9/11. We used to joke, half tongue in cheek, that all the government has to do is say the phrase national security and they can get away with whatever they want. Well, Trump actually says that himself. He just said it a couple weeks ago. He said something like, all I need to do is say national security, and then they have to do what they want. I think this was in reference to the reporter he said that should be jailed.
Well, that's the thing about Trump is he says things out loud that everyone else knows is true, but you're not supposed to actually say it.
well, and the other one that he's good at is labeling people terrorists. So now he's murdering people in the open ocean, alleging that they're terrorists. But that's another national security type word. If you're a
Well,
terrorist,
eh,
then
It's a great example, and it brings up something else that you both mentioned. It's just the bipartisan nature of this. Um,
Right,
you
because
know
Biden
that
used to have his domestic terrorist list, and it was basically people on the right wing of the Republican Party that he wanted to call terrorists and prosecute for
Well,
political.
and Obama had his kill list as
Well,
well.
that's what I was about to say. I mean,
Right.
that's what drives me up the wall about Obama supporters who trusted Obama, 100% to make these decisions. Now, let's take away the fact that Obama had his own kill list, that there was, tons of innocent people who died from drone strikes during the Obama administration. Because Obama supporters did not put up a giant fight about essentially extrajudicial killings that could happen in virtually any country across the world. And the precedent that Obama creates, Trump can supercharge. The same thing can be said for press freedom issues when we're talking about whistleblowers charged under the Espionage Act that happened under Obama. Now, Trump is probably going to prosecute even more by the end of his term than Obama did, which was the highest ever. We can look at the crackdown on WikiLeaks. Yes, the Obama administration, to its one credit on press freedom issues, decided not to prosecute Julian Assange because even they realized that they had what was the New York Times problem, essentially the idea that, well, what's going to stop a future administration from charging any newspaper under these laws? But then a Biden administration decided to go ahead with it anyways. And now the idea that you can go after a publisher under the Espionage Act is something that the Trump administration learned. Well, maybe this can be a success. So we've seen Trump, for example, raid a Washington Post reporter's home because they were charging a alleged source under the Espionage Act, a raid that hasn't happened by the federal government in modern history. So everything that Democratic politicians can do, future Republican politicians can do, they can do it even worse, and vice versa. And the more Republicans and Democrats realize this and decide to fight for press freedom and First Amendment principles, regardless of who is in charge, the better off we'll be.
Well, we only have a few minutes to go over Europe, but we publish not a newsletter, but a website called freespeechnews.org, and it just aggregates threats to free speech, news articles about threats to free speech around the world. But a lot of them end up being about the UK and Europe because there's so much happening there with respect to the government, either the EU or the UK government, suppressing expression of their people, sanctioning their own people. We had on Jacques Beau, who was sanctioned by the EU with no due process whatsoever, and has the same problem that WikiLeaks had. He can't buy groceries. So what's happening over there, and what do you think is driving it for the really aggressive suppression of their citizens' speech? Why is that happening there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I should say that I'm more of an expert in United States free speech and First Amendment law. However, as many problems as this country has, like I think the fact that the First Amendment still does exist. We are very fortunate because in a lot of other countries, including the UK, they don't have a First Amendment. And, in the UK, like when we're talking about the press, they have an Official Secrets Act where the government actually can issue what is known as a D notice and go to a newspaper and say, you can't publish this. We are handing you this piece of paper, and if you publish this, then you're going to jail. And so, Europe has different free speech traditions than the United States, but because we live in this global world, all of this stuff ends up filtering down to us anyways, especially when we're looking at online speech. So for example, if the UK or European countries decide to do something like make end-to-end encryption illegal so that you can't have private conversations with people, that could potentially affect the whole world because tech companies could say, oh, well, now because one country decided to ban it, we're gonna eliminate it for everybody. And so I think Americans do have to pay more attention about what happens in other countries more than they ever have before because we are so connected on the internet at a global scale. But the other thing that we have to realize is that free speech is on the decline, not just in the United States and not just in Europe, but virtually everywhere in the world. Like if you look at the numbers that Committee to Protect Journalists releases every year about the number of journalists jailed or the number of journalists killed, the numbers are astronomical, and they keep going up. And so we've seen a backlash against free speech, virtually everywhere. And I think it's a cause for concern whether you live in those places or not.
In the few minutes we have left, what is your opinion about the state of whistleblowing today? Let's maybe stay in this country since that's your expertise. But what is will there be another WikiLeaks? Are there places where whistleblowers, people who see government crimes and have no channels to report them, and have to go to the press, will there still be places where the public can see this information that we have a right to see? If our government's committing crimes, I think we all agree that we need. If we're going to live in a democracy, we need to know what our government is doing with our tax dollars, and with the power that we give them as elected officials. So are there still places, or do you think that the persecution of Assange has really made it too risky for publishers to publish this material?
Well, I would say a few things. So number one, there's definitely a chill in the idea that now there has been a case in which the government has gone after a publisher of truthful information, charged them under the Espionage Act, and gotten a guilty plea. There's no doubt that legal departments around the country are taking that into account when they decide what they're going to publish and what not, and that is an absolute shame for the American public, because again, so much of this happens behind closed doors, behind the secrecy system. But I actually think that the chances of there being a WikiLeaks another WikiLeaks is slim for another reason, and that is because the time with which WikiLeaks happened was a very short window where information within the government had been digitized, and there was an easy way to send it to WikiLeaks or other news organizations. Yet at the same time, the government didn't have total surveillance capabilities over the people that were accessing that information. Unfortunately, 10 or 12 or 14 years later, after WikiLeaks' biggest publications, the US government has gotten very good at surveilling its own employees. So now anytime one of the millions of people who has a security clearance accesses a document, they know exactly who accessed it, exactly where they accessed it, if they printed it, if they changed it, if they cut and pasted, if they changed to USB. If they take a picture of it with their phone, they have surveillance cameras that they can locate who this happens to. And so it makes it a lot harder for the American public to get these big tranches of documents sent to a new WikiLeaks or any other news organization, because the government has figured out yet another mechanism to lock down their secrecy system. It means that, where maybe in 2010 or 2003, 100,000 people had access to a document, and it would mean that there would be 100,000 suspects when the leak came out. Well, now they can see that, actually on May 5th, there was only 6 people that accessed this document out of 100,000 that could have. And so their suspect pool shrinks very dramatically, and it makes it much easier for them to control sources and whistleblowers. So, that is the pessimistic view. The optimistic view is that there still are people talking to news organizations every day, and sources can adapt, news organizations can adapt, and I certainly haven't given up hope that more whistleblowers can and will come forward, because somebody's conscience can be the most powerful tool in the world. And that means that we have to be fighting on the technological level. It means that's why we build tools for journalists to communicate with sources to make it a bit safer. We have to fight on the legal level. Just because both parties are insanely corrupt does not mean we shouldn't be trying to pass laws that can protect journalists from surveillance in the future. And you can also fight on the state and local level. Even if you think that Congress is broken, which I certainly do. But state and local governments, both Democrat and Republican, pass bad laws sometimes, but they also sometimes still pass bipartisan good laws that can protect journalists, whether we're talking about anti-SLAPP laws that can prevent the type of libel lawsuits that Donald Trump brings in state court, or protect journalists from surveillance or subpoenas, or lay down the rules of the road that say, actually, the police can't arrest journalists who are merely covering a protest. So there's a whole host of things that we can do. And while the First Amendment, I would say, is in trouble, it's certainly not dead yet.
Well, we hope not. And we really appreciate all the work you do to keep it alive. And, you know, there's still a long road ahead. And, you know, we always try to end on an optimistic note anyway. But
That was
there's so much
semi-optimistic.
to be pessimistic about. So it's nice to end on an optimistic note. And so you did well, Trevor. So thank you for all your work on this subject, which is near and dear to us. So, and we'd love to have you back sometime because there's always the next abomination's right around the corner. And
Oh,
you'll be there to
anytime. It was
cover
a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you, Trevor.